Hi, and welcome to our third objective for Chapter 11, Public Goods and Common Resources. At this point, you should have a really good understanding of what a public good is. Remember, those are non-excludable and non-rival. We're now going to turn our attention to common resources, and I'm going to introduce a concept called cost-benefit analysis. And you'll see in the next objective, actually, there's a video, pretty well-produced video on YouTube, which kind of explains the idea of cost-benefit analysis. So without further ado, let me share my slides with you, and we'll go ahead and talk about common resources. Okay, so in this particular objective, again, we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to introduce first the idea of a cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is the heart, really, of economic thinking. Remember, in economic thinking, we know that individuals will do actions as long as the benefit of that action outweighs the cost. So if the benefit is greater than the cost, individuals will continue to engage in that activity until the benefit equals the cost. One of the problems that we have with these goods that do not have a market to them is it's difficult to analyze the cost and the benefit. So what is the cost to society to provide, for example, a public park? And then what's the benefit? And the benefit is really difficult because if you think about what is the benefit to you, it might change at particular points in time, not only based upon what's going on in society, but more so what's going on personally. So it's really difficult to measure a cost and a benefit for many of these public goods, and more so for common resources. Okay, jump back into our slides. Okay. Okay. All right. So in order to decide whether or not, we have to look at the total benefits of all those who use the good. Now, I don't use a public park. I have a lot of property. So when I look at the total benefit of a public park, it's very low to me, but it might be very high compared to others. Then we have to look at the cost of providing and maintaining that public good. Again, this is why you will see some common resources starting to become excludable or private resources, okay, because of the cost of providing and maintaining that particular public good. Okay, now again, estimation becomes kind of important. And again, I think if you are an outdoors person, you might really place a high benefit on public parks, whereas if you're not, you may not. And so the government has to decide whether or not to provide these resources. And remember the idea of scarcity, there's only so much money to go around to fund these particular types of things. Again, we have to, there's no prices here, and so we have to estimate the social benefits and the resource costs. Okay, at this point, what I'd like to do is to turn our attention to common resources. Remember, common resources are those resources which are not excludable, but they are rival in consumption, meaning one person's use precludes someone else's. We see these in many things which are nature dwelling. So what exactly do I mean by that? Let's take a look. So a common resource are not excludable and anyone can use them. Okay, they are rival. And when we look at this, we use a parable to kind of explain what happens. And we're going to talk about the tragedy of the commons. In the tragedy of the commons, basically, let's assume that we're back in medieval times and no one owns the land except for the feudal lord. And each of us live in these little circles around this really nice, lush green pasture. Now, since we're in medieval times, the one way to raise revenue, or the one way to get income is to allow livestock to use the pasture. So what we do is, I want you to think about, if you're person 1 and 2 and 3, how many sheep do you want? And what I would do is go around the room at this point and talk about and ask these 9 individuals how many sheep they want. I usually get low numbers, 2 to 3, for example, maybe 1, maybe 2, 3, and then I have person 5 here, which will say 110. And then we go back down to 4, 2, 1, and I don't want any. Now, what's interesting is when we look at the different answers here, why would someone not want 110? The cost here is 0, except for feeding, but all you have to do is let the sheep into the pasture. And it works as long as the numbers are low, because no one overuses this resource. Here, we can't exclude anyone from using it, so no exclusion. But one person's use, and more so overuse, will mean that there's less nice pasture to go around. Okay, so here we see the rival idea. So especially with person 5 here, who wants 110 sheep, these individuals, 6 through 9, the pasture is going to be overgrazed, and we're going to see that they don't get a whole lot of benefit. If I were person 9, I would also be kind of irritated, because I likewise have access to this pasture, but I can't graze my sheep there, not that I want any. Now, we would say that person 9 is important, because through person 9 of S that they don't want any sheep, they get a benefit from the others raising sheep, and maybe they become a buyer. Now you can see where we're starting to talk about, okay, so now we end up with a demand curve. Everyone else is going to have the supply curve. Well, then it becomes a private resource. It does not become a common resource. So in this example, we can see, because person 5 wants so many sheep grazing in this pasture, that it means that there's less lush pasture to go around. Those coming after them might not be able to use the pasture at all. What kinds of solutions could we have then to this pasture idea? And this is normally where I would again poll the class and say, what do you think? And this is usually the answers that we get. The first one is, how about we treat it similar to pollution? And we have sheep permits, so that those that use this the most, so the use of the common resource, now comes at a cost. Another example or another solution that students often talk about is, let's divide this up. And if we divide it up and each person gets an equal share of the lot, person 9 here is, who wanted no sheep, they're in a really good situation to sell maybe their land plot or lease it to someone. Again, you see how we're making this a private good at this point. The other option, besides permits, right, leasing it out, might be laws about how many sheep that you can have. And that sounds an awful lot like a command and control approach. So we might say that your maximum amount of sheep that you can have is 3. So that's basically everyone's going to get 3 or less. And again, so we kind of see a marketable solution over here with the permits, taking a private solution in the leasing, and then a command and control approach setting a maximum. Many counties have a maximum about how much livestock you can have, what types of livestock, and some of those kinds of things. So we still see this today, even though when we were talking about the tragedy of the commons, it really was the idea that it was in medieval times. And again, this idea is a negative externality because individuals are not bearing the cost, because the common resource is non-excludable. Here's some examples of common resources. Test questions have to do with fish, whales, and what's the difference between them and a dog. We would say a dog is a private good, whereas fish and whales are common resources. Now, it's important that we establish private property rights, so a legal authority to control it. And if you remember in Chapter 10, when we were deciding if an externality was present, we first asked, do you have the legal right? Who has that legal right? And so this idea of private property rights in the tragedy of the commons and more so allocations of resources becomes a really important point for us to consider. If we don't have private property rights, we get these market failures. And that's where the government can solve the problem either through a market-based approach or command and control. Okay, well, and that is Objective 3. So I hope this has provided you with a little bit of idea about common resources and an introduction to the tragedy of the commons. I have a YouTube video on this same page which really goes into in depth about the tragedy of the commons. And then for the fourth objective, the cost benefit, as I said, I don't have a lecture that I'm doing for it, but we can watch the YouTube video, which I would have showed you anyway in class, and that helps to explain that objective. And that finishes Chapter 11. Thanks for your time and attention, and remember to email me if you have any questions.